So the second stage after the requirement inception, in which we decided to proceed or not to proceed with the assumption that we are now proceeding, is the requirement elicitation. So after you perform preliminary investigation and you have the preliminary investigation report and you decided to go for or not to go for the project, so you now about and you have the official documentations, and then with the assumption that you will go for the projects, you will do requirement elicitation. So requirement elicitation, it involved a sequence of steps, starting from understanding the business, the application domain, identifying the source of requirements, and then analyzing the stakeholders, which we call stakeholder analysis, and then selecting the techniques and approaches and tools, and finally do elicitation to the requirements. In today's class, I will talk about understanding the problem domains in the 7 dimensions related to requirement elicitation. What are the different resources that we could use to gather and elicit requirements, and the stakeholders analysis, how the stakeholder analysis could be performed, some like initial idea about some of the techniques and available tools for requirement elicitations. And next class, we will work on more details about those techniques as well as the eliciting the requirement stage. So the main objectives of the requirement elicitation, including understanding of the processes, people, and resources involved, in addition to determining the coverage and the boundary of the future system, which is the main scope of the system. Keep in mind that requirement elicitation would result in very important decisions at the end, because it has all the requirements that will be later analyzed. So if requirement elicitation is done in a wrong way, there will be huge consequences to correct or to even go over the defects that were not detected during the requirement elicitation. That's why, keep in mind, at the end, it's a very important decision that will result after the requirement elicitation related to all the requirements needed for the project, by which we could design the structure specification document so we can send it to the developer team. So if this was done wrong, there would be huge consequences. There are different requirements that will be collected during the requirement elicitation phase. And actually, those requirements will depend on different level of priority. So the initial step of requirement is identifying the domain, application domain, which is not only one dimension. When it comes to the requirement elicitation phase, there are 7 dimensions that are actually required or identified in the requirement elicitation. And the reason for this is, it just like requirement elicitation is not just a straightforward task. It's not just collecting requirements and that's it. It's not just about simple writing down those requirements and then based on those gathering or meeting or those gathering tools through questionnaires and interviews with the stakeholders. There are 7 dimensions that we need to understand that aligned with the requirement stations. And we have to guarantee that we are capable to satisfy those 7 dimensions in order to have a successful requirement elicitation process. Starting from understanding the business. Requirement engineers, they must understand how the new system contributes to the business organization. To do so, it required them to understand the needs of business management as well as the nature of the business and those aspects of the business that would impact on the development of the new system. The second dimension is understanding the application domain. A requirement engineer and system analyst must also understand the general application domain within the business in which the new system is to be implemented. Third, understand the specific problem. That means the requirement engineer or the system, the software analyst should have great understanding of the general application domain that must be focused on for later usage. So requirement engineer must also understand the specific problem assigned by the system. Number four, understanding the needs and constraints of the system stakeholders. The specific needs actually and constraints of stakeholders, they must be understood by requirement engineers. They may be several different sets of criteria by which the final system is judged. Additionally, the specific context within which stakeholders describe their requirements must also be understood, as must the language they use, their biases or not. Also, the need to trade off various requirements would rely on understanding of the needs of the stakeholders. So this is crucial step is to understand the needs and the constraints of the stakeholders. Following this, there is a great need of understanding acquisition and project management. So for requirement engineers in particular, they are heavily involved in defining the system requirements, which are in effect the system scope on which project managers would develop the project work breakdown structure. Um, this is why it's mandatory to understand the acquisition and project management, because at the end, requirement engineers must understand how systems are acquired and how projects are managed. Number six, understanding requirement engineering and system engineering. So, requirement engineer, they would stand on the boundary between the business and the project, as well as understanding the business environment in which the system would be deployed. The requirement engineer must also be able to translate the environment into the system engineer and engineering domains. It is very difficult to contribute to a process that is not understood. Those undertaking requirements elicitation must therefore understand and preferably have significant experience with system engineering and requirement engineering. Finally, understanding the technology and engineering involved. Keep in mind that although it is common to assert that a good manager can manage in any field, even at high level, a manager is not performing to full potential if the managed processes and contributing technology are not understood. This is certainly true at the level of requirement elicitation, where the requirement engineer must understand the technology involved as well as be familiar with their engineering. So you can see here 7 dimensions that must be met in terms of understanding the business, the application domain, the specific problem we are addressing, the customer, stakeholders, and needs, as well as the system needs, understanding acquisition, project management, and engineering and system engineering and management. All of these are dimensions that must be met specifically in the requirements elicitation phase. So after we have those dimensions met, and now we have full understanding of the entire business problem domain and problems in all engineering and management involved, let's look into the second step in the requirement elicitation, which is requirements, the source of the requirements, or identifying those source of requirements. So as we talked before, there are different sources of requirements that we may collect it. It might be from questionnaires, it might be from interviews, it might be from current existing documentations, it might be from observations, it might be even from research vendor solutions. And as you can see here, if we would like to categorize those resources, we might look to discussion with all classes of stakeholders. This is mainly to elicit the requirements based on the individual perspective of the process. We might have resources of requirements that comes out as part of competitive analysis of any competing system already in the marketplace. We might have resources from policy and procedure manuals specifically for the business and process at hand, so that the system interactions and constraints could be easily identified. Also, we might have informations related to the requirements that we are collecting or gathering from the marketing and customer care department. This is more or less could be extracted using either customer surveyed or questionnaires. Also, we could have requirements selected from legacy systems, especially if we have system manual, specification documents, issue logs, and enhancement requests. So now we identify the source of requirements. Before that, we did understanding the entire problem domain, application domain, and everything related to the 7 dimensions of the elicitations. The third step in the requirement elicitations include stakeholder analysis. So in the stakeholder analysis, we actually analyzing the stakeholders and the rationale for this, why we'd like to provide an analysis to the stakeholder. So we do this to identify who needs to participate, either primary stakeholders or secondary stakeholders. We need to assess how stakeholders be affected or might actually affect on the system, either positive or negative. We need to identify the multiple interests and objectives of each stakeholder in relation to the particular project management. We also need to understand the actual resources, the influences of the stakeholders, the authority of the stakeholders, and the power of the stakeholders that could have a greater impact on the project uh, uh, management. Also, we are interested to assess the most appropriate means for the stakeholders to participate. What would encourage them to participate in the project? We would like to begin or initiate understanding of the conflicts that could arise in the project, in addition to assess the capacity of the stakeholders to participate not only in the initiatives of the projects, but also in the planning process. So in order to do stakeholder analysis, there are fundamentally 3 main steps. The first one is to identify who are the stakeholders in your project, to investigate the characteristics of the stakeholders, to identify the power and the influence of the stakeholders. By following those 3 steps, we can easily identify who are the main participants in the project, whether they do have high power or high impact, positive or negative on the project. We could understand the resources and the authority of each of the stakeholders. We can easily identify any conflicts that might arise in the project, in addition to identify the capacity of each stakeholder. For identifying stakeholders, it's mandatory to identify primary stakeholders, secondary stakeholders, and if any of the primary and secondary would have interest in the issue or like in the project or not. So a common tool to do this is the stakeholder rings, which I'll talk about it next. For investigating characteristics of stakeholders, there are different techniques. We call it different metrics representation to assess on the characteristic of the stakeholders, to identify the interest of the stakeholders. There is the 4R matrix, which include the rights of the stakeholders, responsibility of stakeholders, returns of stakeholders, and relationship. Tools that we could use to identify the characteristic of the stakeholders, it could be power and interest grid. So we will talk about this in today's class. You could have the 4R matrix, the 2x2 matrix, for which is identified as the 4R matrix. Could even use the Venn diagram and matrix of conflict and trade-off. So in today's class, I will talk about the power and interest grid. So to identify the power and influence of stakeholders, you need to understand what are the main power and influences of each stakeholders. Tools that could be used in this purpose, including graph of stakeholder importance and influences. So let's go over the main step in the stakeholder analysis, as I said, which is identifying stakeholders. You need to identify those people that would have interest in successful system implementation. There are three primary group of stakeholders in any project. Could be on the user level, like the who will use the system, the client, who will pay for and own the system, like the customer, and the technical staff who will ensure system operations. Every type of a stakeholder is identified by the system analyst. Techniques that can be used to identify stakeholders, including the stakeholder ring. What is a stakeholder ring? Is a partitioning scheme that we use it to identify both, sorry, to identify both the primary stakeholders and the secondary stakeholders. So we could identify priorities of stakeholders based on their interest, if it's direct or indirect to the business. Primary stakeholders are those stakeholders that hold a direct interest in a business organization, and its dealing are known as primary stakeholders. These stakeholders in particular, they usually invest their financial capital directly to the business. Example of primary stakeholders including employee, customers, suppliers, vendors, and business partners. On the other hand, stakeholders that do not hold direct interest in a business, but at the same time, they could have a reasonable influence over business dealings, are known as secondary stakeholders. At this point, an organization doesn't directly depend upon these stakeholders for survival or even their immediate interest. So that's why we call them secondary stakeholders. Example of secondary stakeholders that we can see who actually don't hold direct interest in the business, but still they have like reasonable influence as business competitors. So business competitors are secondary stakeholders, trade union, media groups, pressure groups, maybe local government organizations are all examples of secondary stakeholders. So step number one in stakeholder analysis, identifying stakeholders using the stakeholder log. Example, after you identify the primary and secondary stakeholders, you can see different stakeholders that might be involved in your job as a data as a software analyst in your project. Maybe your boss, maybe your senior executive, maybe your coworker, maybe the entire team, the customer, primary, prospective customer, your family, shareholders, primary, suppliers, primary, lender, analyst, future recruits, key contributors, government. So as you can see here, um, secondary, government, the press, interest group, public, the community, and the key advisors. So you can see for the community, I could classify it for me as secondary. So all of these stakeholders are to be identified in order for us to provide a well stakeholder analysis to come up with the recommendations about who will participate in the project, if their participation positive or negative, how to identify conflicts. These terms or these answers cannot be answered or satisfied unless we identify stakeholders, which is a major component in the stakeholder analysis technique. So when we identify stakeholders, we build what we call a stakeholder register, which is a simple document that contains information about all the stakeholders in the project. It identifies the people, the group, the organizations that have any kind of interest in your project, whether they are primary or whether they are secondary stakeholders. In a stakeholder register, it includes basic information in stakeholders, including their names, their positions, their locations, the role in the project, and contact information. Also, we have assessment information that we keep it in the stakeholder register that include the stakeholder major requirements and expectations, potential influences and phase of the project in which we align each stakeholders and their interest in each phase. Sample stakeholder register can be seen as follows. We start by the name of each stakeholder. For example, like Stephen, he is the VP of operation. He is internal to the project. The rule is a project sponsor, and here's a contact. And then you keep the same for all other stakeholders to identify them as either internal or externals, primary or secondary. In stakeholder classifications, you need to identify if they are internal or external to the organizations in order for you to build the stakeholder register. And also you need to identify if they are supporter to the project or they actually resistant to the project. So some stakeholders could support the project, some stakeholders as competitors, for example, as a secondary stakeholders, they might be resistant to the project. So it's really important when you identify stakeholders in your project is to classify them. You might classify them based on their interest, maybe based on their influence of the project, supportive or resistance. You classify them internal or external. You classify them based on their power. You classify them based on their interest, as I said before. So there are different classifications that you should perform. After the fact, you identify the stakeholders. You could identify them even based on the rule. You could be a champion stakeholder, or it could be from the organizational management stakeholder, or even the system user stakeholders. You could put them in hierarchy level based on what category or criteria you have used to classify your stakeholders. So in order to classify stakeholders, we need to prioritize them. So after identifying the key project stakeholders, you could use different classification method, as I said before, to determine an approach for managing the stakeholders relationship. One common technique that is used a lot to classify stakeholders is called the power interest grid. As I said before, you could classify them external or internal, positive impact or negative impact. Are they actually impacting the project to the extent that they are supporting the project or resistant to the project? But one way is to identify their power and interest using the power interest grid, which actually could be used to group stakeholders based on their level of authority, their power, and their level of concern, interest for the project outcome. It is again a 2x2 matrix. So where on the x-axis we list the interest of each stakeholder. The interest could be between low and high interest. And on the y-axis we list the power. So it could range from low power until high power. So it's 2x2. So now we have 4 regions. So I'm going to call this region number 1, which is keep satisfied, and then region number 2, manage closely. Region number 3, we call them monitor group, and then region number 4, which is keep informed. So as clearly see here that the position that you allocate a stakeholder on the grid shows you the action that you need to take with them. So those people in group 1, you need to keep them satisfied. Those group of stakeholders in number 2, you need to manage closely. Those group in partition 3, you need to monitor them. And those group in number 4, you need to keep informed. Let's look over each of those group separately. So in group number 1, which has that means they do have low interest and high power. So you need to put enough work with these people to keep them satisfied, but not much to the extent that they become bored with your message. So that's why we say people who are really in low interest in the project, but they do have high power in your project, all of the time you need to keep them satisfied. On the other hand, if we have the second group, so if we look to the second group, which means they do have high power and they do have higher interest, so that means you need to manage them very closely. You must fully engage these people and make the greatest effort to satisfy them as well. The third group, that means those group of stakeholders, they do have less interest and they have less power. So they have less interest and less power. That means you need to monitor them. The only action you need to do it as a software engineer, or you could be like a software analyst. You need to monitor these people, but don't bore them with excessive communications. So the fourth group, which is those people who are in high interest um, um, to the project, and at the same time they don't have a lot of power. Adequately, you just need to inform these people and talk to them to ensure that no major issues are arising. And people in this category can often be very helpful with the detail of your project because they are really high interested in the project. So as you can see here, this grid is really good to classify your stakeholders, because once you classify your stakeholders, you could identify what action need to be taken from and to each stakeholder to provide or to guarantee successful requirements elicitation. So if you cannot classify your stakeholders, that means you cannot guarantee that the entire elicitation purpose is achieved. And that means your requirement elicitation process was not successful. And actually that would impact on the entire phase. So the following graph is actually an example to the power and interest grid with stakeholder marked. So maybe like Amanda McKay, she is in group number 2, which we would need to provide management closely to her. And she has high interest but and high power. Here for Pierce Marshalls might be of low interest, but they have power, so that means you have to keep satisfied all the time. So part of the stakeholder analysis using the classification method of power interest grid is to identify or group your stakeholders along different dimensions of interest and power. So after we identify the stakeholders using any classification method, here I just share with you just one example using the power interest grid, you need to identify the stakeholder engagement levels. We might see stakeholders who are actually completely unaware of the project and its potential impact on them. We might see or classify them as resistant. So, like we say, those stakeholders are resistant, who are aware of the project, but yet resistant to any change. Some of them are neutral, they are aware of the project, yet neither supportive or resistant. We might have them as supportive, who are actually aware of the project and supportive of any change, and leading, who are aware of the project and they can take any action at any time. So you can see here in the following table, which actually other classification of your stakeholders based on power of interest. So this is a way of classifying them and their current engagement. So you can see here different classification methods of the stakeholders could be adopted in the same report. We can say Stephen, we know that he has high power and high interest, and at the same time his stakeholder engagement level is leading. While Ryan, he has medium power and high interest, and his current engagement is supportive. And maybe you could have also some strategies to provide potential management for each stakeholder that could be added also in the classification table. So once we identify or classify our stakeholders and we provided potential management strategy, It's very important that project teams should develop a plan to manage um, the stakeholders. So you do have a strategy to manage the stakeholders, and then along with this strategy, the plan should include current and desired management and engagement level, interrelationships between stakeholders, communication requirements, and potential management strategy for each stakeholder, methods for updating the stakeholder management plan. So, in summary, so far we have talked about inception. We require inception, followed by requirement elicitation, and the first three phases, including the first two phases, including understanding the problem domain and the entire project scope, followed by um, actually three phases, followed by the resource of requirements, identify resource of requirement, and then stakeholders analysis. The fourth stage is identifying different techniques for requirement elicitation. So what I'm sharing with you is just like a brief description of each of those techniques. Next class, we will talk about them in more details, including observation. We could use observation as a way for eliciting requirements, which include observation of users of work, obtain information that are not told by the customers. So you might want to do some job protocol analysis or even social analysis. Interviewing as a finding tool could also be used for eliciting requirements, in which we know that it requires good skilled preparation and listening. You need to ask specific details related to boundary, exception, and anticipating changes. You will need to collect information about the vision of the future, what kind of alternatives that might be available, what is the minimum acceptable solution, and other sources of information that might be needed. A way for requirement station include brainstorming, which require more moderated meetings to trick a lot of questions, prototyping to simulate reactions by using questionnaires as again as fact finding to conduct full list of questions, scenarios, and use cases are also widely used for requirement elicitation. As you can see, all of these, most of these, if not all, are finding tools that could be used on the elicitation phase or even could be used at the inception phase or analysis and specification phases. We will talk about these techniques in next week in more details. So problems that occurs in the elicitation phase, including inadequate time allotted. The preparation was not done in a well established plan. The user representation was not adequate as well. There are different vocabulary, big means like developers and users, they might speak different language that is really challenging to elicit requirements. It might be some political factors that affect on the elicitation of requirements. There might be ambiguity of the natural language between all the stakeholder types. Also, the dynamic change of requirements would affect on the elicitation process, because you have to guarantee that every time requirements are changed, the elicitation dynamically will be updated. Also, the inability of stakeholders to actually articulate requirements. They are not supportive, they are not cooperated, that will impact on the elicitation. Also, which I just referred to is a lack of cooperation, because they don't want to be committed or even to buy in during the project scope analysis. Also, they might have conflicts between the stakeholder requirements, like the one a stakeholder they would like requirement A, another stakeholder would like requirement B, and actually A and B are conflicting. So maybe stakeholder A, they would like the throughput of the project not to exceed 20 seconds. And then the requirement for stakeholder B, they would like the throughput of the project, as example, to be less to be greater than 20 seconds. So this is conflicting. So the conflict between those requirements will have an issue in eliciting an accurate requirements. Or maybe the stakeholders are providing unrealistic requirements. So at this point, it's hard to come up with recommendations for the design team in the design phase. So these are the main problems in the elicitation phase. So this is the end of today's class, and next week we will go into more details about different techniques that are used for requirements elicitation. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.